Hello, this is Scott Horton. I've just opened the room for attendees, so people will start joining here. We will get started in just a few minutes. Hi, people are starting to come in. This is Scott Horton. I'll be presenting today's webinar. Thanks for joining us. We will get started as scheduled in just a few minutes. Welcome again as more people have logged in. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. You should now have the cover slide for the presentation, Reopening New York Part 2 on your screen. You should also have access to a chat window, which is where you'll be able to ask questions. I'll go over all this again as we get started. But again, we'll just wait a couple minutes until everyone has had a chance to log in now that the webinar is open. If anyone wants to type anything in the chat just to make clear that this is all working, that'd be great. Otherwise, like I said, you should have the cover slide on your screen and we'll get started in just a few minutes. Okay, thank you all for letting me know that this is working on your end. Sounds like we have everything up and running. So again, we're just gonna wait and let everyone who has a interest in being here from the beginning of the presentation get logged in, and in just a minute or two, we will get started. Just a reminder as people are coming into the room, generally we don't have many problems, but if you do have other apps running on your device or computer, and especially if they're memory intensive, it could interfere, cause lags or something like that in the webinar. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you are having any trouble, try closing other apps down and maybe that will improve your performance. Otherwise, we're at the start time, but I'm still going to give another maybe minute before I officially kick off the webinar. Okay, again, hi, I am Scott Horton, founder and attorney with Horton Law based in Orchard Park, New York. We still have people joining, but I'm going to go ahead and start with some of the preliminary information. So you should have access to a chat room or chat window, and you should see the slide presentation at least the cover slide, Reopening New York Part 2, still going through a phase on your screen. If you can see that, access the chat and hear me, then everything is working properly for you. What we will aim to do is take about 1 hour for this presentation, and including question and answers, we may go a little longer because I typically will stay on as long as necessary to answer any questions that are asked during the presentation. Keep in mind as you're entering questions that this is not a confidential forum, and other people may see your questions or hear my answers. So don't ask specific questions that might reveal who you are. Even if you are clients of our firm, there would be no attorney-client privilege in that exchange. And obviously, if you have questions that need to be more confidentially answered, you should contact us directly or your attorneys directly. But if you do have questions throughout the presentation, please type them into chat and we will see those, and I will answer the questions most likely at the end during question and answer. But if I happen to see a question come up that I can fit an answer into what I'm saying, I might do that. But don't worry, if I don't answer your question immediately, we will get to it at the end of the presentation. You will have access to the slides. I'll make those available at the end after the presentation. And again, if you have any technical problems as you're going, try closing other apps on your computer, because it typically is a resource issue more than anything on our end that we can do anything about during the presentation. So with that, I'm going to get started. I presented last month, Reopening New York Part 1. This is Reopening New York Part 2. Assuming you have operations somewhere in New York that you're interested in, you know that New York has really been following a 4-phased plan. So I intentionally called this Part 1, Part 2, rather than referencing the specific phases, because different parts of the state are in different phases, as I'll go over in a minute. And as I'll also discuss today, there are a lot of areas and industries throughout the state that are not neatly tied to a particular phase. So again, this is Part 2, and I expect there will be at least a Part 3 webinar coming in the future. So again, it's not just a focus on any particular phase of New York's reopening, but just kind of where we are overall at this point in time. This slide was actually in the Part 1 webinar. I think it was the last slide before, the contact information or whatever that I have at the end. So I just wanted to bring this forward to sort of transition us from where we left off. If you were not able to watch that first webinar, you can actually go watch it through our website, and I can point you to that. We went in more in detail on some of the phase 1 guidelines at that point in time. I did warn, again, on this slide at the last webinar, that the guidelines themselves warn that they might change, and in fact they have. If you were in a phase 1 industry and looked at those guidelines a month ago, or 3 weeks ago, or frankly even last week, the guidelines have changed. They've all pretty much been updated in the last couple of days with a few changes that I will try to talk about. There are now dozens of various industry guidelines available from the state, so I can't, do a walkthrough of every guideline at this point and exactly what changed, but we will talk about some of the things that have changed. But again, each business that's open now in New York is supposed to have reviewed the state guidelines and affirmed that they will comply with it, including any revisions, and there have been revisions to any guidelines that came out pretty much before this week. Guidelines continue to come out on a daily basis, maybe not quite daily basis, but we never know on a daily basis whether we'll get new guidelines today. This morning, the state did pretty quietly release on its website the guidelines for basically youth and non-collegiate, non-professional sports. So I'm going to touch on that. I haven't had a chance to fully read it because they've only been available for a couple of hours, and I've otherwise been preparing for this webinar, and most of you are not from a business standpoint involved in those sports, but many of you, whether through your children or yourself personally, might have interest in those. So I will briefly mention that in a minute. But again, mostly that's an indication of how quickly and suddenly things pop up. The transition between stages is uncertain. As I noted before, we have been so far in New York following generally the 14-day or 2-week guidelines that the governor had indicated up front, but it has not been 2 weeks to the day in every situation. The biggest variable I see coming up is the transition from phase 3 to phase 4. Phase 4 includes, for example, education, and there's no reason to believe that the state is going to generally reopen education as of the beginning of July, which is 2 weeks from when many parts of the state got into phase 3. So I'm very interested to see what happens in phase 4. I know a lot of media outlets and a lot of just discussion is based around phase 4 starting in late June, early July through most parts of the state, excluding New York City. But I'm not sure exactly how that's going to work, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Going backward is a possibility. So far, New York has been very fortunate that the numbers have all gone in the right direction, and there have been no halts to reopening within phases or preventing transition from phase to phase. The governor did, however, in the last week, note the specific possibility that if certain communities, meaning towns or in New York City, boroughs, for example, were not adequately policing the guidelines, then those specific geographic areas may get shut down or halted, going backwards, what have you, separate and apart from what the rest even of their region is experiencing. He called out specifically Manhattan and the Hamptons at that point in time, based on large crowds that were not following social distancing or wearing masks. There hadn't been much more follow up on that, but again, it's always a possibility, either because the numbers change generally throughout the state or a region, or even on a more limited basis. The governor this morning, well, might have been this afternoon by the time he got to this, but just earlier today noted that in the central New York area, there is an uptick in the percentage positive rate on tests, but they've been able to trace it to a specific Apple manufacturer, which when he said that, I was thinking about the computer, device company, the iPhone company or whatever, but he meant apples as in the fruit you eat. So an apple processing facility somewhere in central New York apparently has had, I think he said 34 positive cases suddenly. As he noted, that's good and bad news. Bad news that there's the 34 cases. Good news that they were able to trace them all to people who worked in that facility, and hopefully keep it contained so it doesn't spread throughout that region and then risk the rest of the region having to slow down with its reopening or potentially go backwards. I also said before the federal government could step in or not. I think in the last 3 weeks, months since the last presentation, the federal government has basically done nothing. So for whatever it's worth, we're more on the or not side. This is relevant both in the funding that New York and some other states, desperately need to maintain their level of, services, education, police, fire, medical, stuff like that. And it could also relate to the guidelines on businesses. In fact, it does. So while the White House, to be frank and not to try to be political, is basically acting as if the coronavirus no longer exists. And separate and apart from whether that's true, New York is certainly acting as though it does and continuing to impose and enforce these guidelines. The guidelines, however, do specifically reference and require compliance with CDC guidelines, which do continue to be updated. And in that way, the federal government is in part dictating what's going on in New York, because all of the guidelines that businesses in New York must agree to follow include the obligation to comply with relevant CDC guidelines. The regional reopening map as of today looks like this. Pretty much all of upstate New York is now in phase 3. The mid-Hudson Valley, I guess, which you might consider to be sort of the line of demarcation between upstate and New York and downstate, somewhere in there, is still in phase 2. Long Island is still in phase 2, and New York City, which of course had the highest numbers in the first place, is still in phase 1. Some more information on that for reference, more than anything. So 5 regions went into phase 3 Monday of this week. Western New York, where I am and probably many of you are, went into phase 3 on Tuesday. The capital region got there yesterday. The Mid-Hudson Valley or Hudson Valley region is expected to get to phase 3 next Tuesday. Long Island is suspected to get there next Wednesday at this point, and these are dates provided by the governor. So this is not just merely counting the 14 days. He specifically identified these dates yesterday. And both yesterday and then again today, the governor confirmed that New York City is still on track to begin phase 2 on Monday, June 22nd. So, that's relevant. So most of the state has now experienced phase 2 and is starting to experience phase 3. Obviously, downstate is trailing behind. Phase 2 for New York City, keep in mind, is going to generally include offices. And obviously, there are probably more offices in New York City than the rest of the state combined easily. So it is a much different undertaking in New York City generally than it is for many areas of the rest of the state, excluding the densest business areas of some of the cities. Real quick, I just want to go ahead and throw out a question just to keep everybody a little bit on your toes. And I'm just going to start with a quick poll, completely anonymous. Is your business open for some level of on-site work? This means either you've been essential or you're in the phase where you've been allowed to reopen. If you're secretly open but clearly shouldn't be, you can answer how you want, but nobody's going to know. So you see that poll come up, and you'll have a chance to click just to give us a quick idea. And I recognize too, this could include some of you saying no, even though you could be open, because of course you don't have to be open just because you could be open. Hopefully that's due to a business choice and less due to financial restraints or inability to have workers or something like that. So it's bouncing a little bit, but it looks like, as I expected, the majority of you are in businesses that are open, somewhat on site, and that's about 2/3 of you, and then about 1/3 are not open. Nobody's saying don't know or they're not sure, which is good. It's that you're all clued in as to whether your business is open to some level or not. All right, so with that, we'll wrap up that poll and move on. Just want to go back through the phases a little bit. I'm not going to spend as much time as I kind of said in the introduction on each phase at this point, just because there's so much going on within each phase. I wouldn't have time to try to cover it. But I thought this was a little bit helpful to show how things are still evolving, even within the phases and even within some of the phases most of the states already been through. So phase 1 businesses, this was the original list as of the last webinar I did. It has not changed much, except the state has added higher education research to this list. So while education has always been listed in phase 4, pure research at the higher education, college, university level has been now deemed a phase 1 business. Honestly, I don't know exactly when that was added because I didn't track it specifically to the day, but that is up there now as a phase 1 business. The original phase 2 business list was professional services, retail, administrative support, real estate, rental, and leasing. This is where we saw the biggest change by the time the state actually got to phase 2 and published guidelines for industries. They changed their approach on this to the following. So instead of generically professional services and administrative support, they went to an office-based work industry group, which of course is pretty broad. It's if you have employees working in an office. Earlier there was working in manufacturing. Now there's going to be some potential overlap, and basically the concept is you have to follow either what most specifically applies to your business or the combination of guidelines that collectively apply. So if you have office operations, but then you also have manufacturing operations, you probably should be looking at both sets of guidelines, and in some cases may even need to affirm compliance with both sets of guidelines. I mean, for the most part, there's not dramatic differences between the guidelines, especially for similar industries, but of course, manufacturing has different concerns than offices and different concerns than retail at some levels. So offices, real estate, in-store retail was a component of phase 2, which allowed more than just curbside pickup and delivery operations. But the reason there's an asterisk here is technically this says essential and in-store retail in phase 2 businesses. There is a list of what is included in this type of retail. I can't tell you everything that's the hair salon, barber shop, and personal care types of operations that otherwise arguably might be retail. There's specific guidelines for retail, rental, repair, and cleaning. So that's separate and apart from this general retail. The vehicle sales has a separate category. And then, food service remains different, even if you might arguably consider that retail. Outdoor takeout delivery was allowed in phase 2. Takeout and delivery food service had been allowed as an essential function anyway. But like all of these industry specific, phase specific guidelines, if you were already open as an essential business, once there's an industry specific guideline that pops up in a phase, your business is now obligated to comply with that. So the phase 2 difference was allowing outdoor seating. Phase 3, which a lot of the state is now in, expanded food service and restaurants to allow indoor seating. This was the original listing, restaurants and food service, for whatever it's worth. When they finally issued guidelines, the guidelines more generally refer to food services and added personal care. Personal care essentially includes the things that hair salons and barber shops were not allowed to do in phase 2. which was pretty much anything other than cut hair and color hair and style hair. In other words, they couldn't even do beard trimming, for example. So all that is now in this personal care under phase 3, but it also includes things like tanning salons, massages, and tattoos, hence the picture here. I have one message that someone can't hear me. Assuming you can hear me, it looks like everything's right on my end. Could you please let me know? Okay, well, it sounds like some people can hear me. Yeah, I appreciate people saying reconnect. So everything is good from my side. So hopefully it was just something on your system. Try to get back in and hopefully that works. Obviously, if you can't hear me, it doesn't help me to tell you that. But thanks to people posting in chat to help them out. All right, so that was up to phase 3. Nobody is further than that. And phase 4, still as it originally did, is listed this way: arts, entertainment, recreation, and education. As I alluded to earlier, the 2-week period for some of these regions would begin around the beginning of July. At this point, the state is requiring, for example, public school districts to submit their reopening plans by, I think it's July 16th. It's the middle of July. After which point in time, it's expected that the state will provide guidelines for reopening. So clearly, they're not going to have their reopening for education, including public schools, available by early July. So I don't see how that part of phase 4 is coming soon. As for the arts, entertainment, and recreation aspect of phase 4, I want to jump to the next slide. And this is an area where, outside of the individual phases, the state has a separate category of so-called statewide guidelines. The statewide guidelines, in some respects, trump the phase guidelines and say everybody in the state can now do this regardless of what phase you're in. In other respects, they say anybody in the state can do this, people can do this if they're in a certain phase, and then you can do these other things if you're in a different phase. So if you take a look at the current statewide guidelines, childcare, day camps, lake and ocean beaches, religion, funeral services, racing activities, dentistry, auto racing, public transportation, sports and recreation. There may actually be one or two more that I didn't get onto the slide. There is, at least at one point in time, if it's still not up there, there was one that I basically called the Buffalo Bills guidelines because it was for training facilities for professional sport teams in New York. And for the most part, I'm pretty sure that the only professional sport team in the state of New York that was actually training was the Buffalo Bills. Maybe some minor exceptions somewhere as well, but pretty much it was the Buffalo Bills. Anyway, if you look at all these and go back and look at phase 4, arts, entertainment, recreation, education, I mean, you see some pretty considerable overlap with these statewide guidelines. The sports and recreation component here at the end, these guidelines just went up this morning, and they specifically exclude professional and collegiate sports. They reference youth sports, but I assume and think that they encompass any recreational sport, regardless of how old the participants are. And the approach they take is to divide a long list of sports into 3 categories of lower risk, moderate risk, and higher risk. Lower risk activities can pretty much already be done, and they're qualifying them as essential businesses. So that includes things like singles, tennis, and golf, some of the things with some fairly inherent social distancing involved. The moderate risk sports include baseball, soccer now, water polo, gymnastics, crew, and even specifically paintball, among some other things. So then that leaves a third list of higher risk sports that includes football, wrestling, ice hockey, rugby, basketball, contact lacrosse, volleyball, competitive cheer, and group dancing. And then each of these categories has a catch-all for other sports and recreation with similar abilities to maintain physical distance and share equipment. So pretty much the contact sports are in this higher risk category. The reason that's important for those of you that are interested in these types of activities, again, the lower risk sports are deemed essential and can be done now anywhere in the state. The moderate risk categories now can be engaged in as of July 6th, which is what the governor previously said, in regions that have reached or surpassed phase 3. So by then, that should pretty much include the whole state, with the exception possibly of New York City. Although it is within the realm of possibility that New York City will hit phase 3 at about that time. There is a specific exception for competitive tournaments that require travel. I'm not aware of a definition of travel there, so that might be relevant to some of you who have kids in travel sports, or if you participate in some sort of traveling tournament related sport yourself. But there's more detail on that. I just wanted to point that out both because the latest and newest thing, also just as an example of how these things pop up, and where you might have previously been thinking you were going to be covered under certain guidelines. Now there's some new specific guideline that pertains to you. Presumably at some point in time, those guidelines will get revised to allow for activity in the higher risk sports, but right now it does allow for some training and practicing in those sports as long as distancing can be maintained, but not competition in those higher risk sports. All right, with all of that background, I just want to throw out too, if you don't know where your business falls, then there is a reopen lookup tool on the state website. Here's the link, that if you click on it, you type in what county you're in and the NAICS code for your business. If you don't know the NAICS code for your business, then you can, and that's NAICS, you can look it up right there on the website based on the nature of the business, or you can, find it somewhere else on the web and then type it in. But that provides a pretty helpful summary of where your region is on that particular activity, and it will get surprisingly detailed, like your business is in this phase, but only to the extent that you do this and not to the extent that you do something else. That was an issue, for example, with the hair salons and barber shops. At one point in time, it actually said, yes, you can be open, but oh, by the way, all you can do is sell hair products for pickup or delivery. Then it got to, yes, you can cut hair, but you can't do other things, including trim beards. And then now where phase 3 comes along, there's personal care industry guidelines that'll let those types of businesses do more. So again, none of this is carte blanche across the board, reopen, you can do whatever you want. All of it comes with parameters. For each of these industry groups that I've just talked about through the phases and the statewide guidelines, there are these 3 relevant documents. There's summary guidelines, detailed guidelines, and the state also has a safety plan template out there. The summary guidelines are slightly more user-friendly, perhaps. Honestly, I sent my wife the sports guidelines that came out this morning because we have children whom that will immediately affect. And she wrote back that I think you need to be a lawyer to read this. So that the detailed guidelines anyway. The summary guidelines I'm not sure are much better, but they are set up differently in more of a chart format than a purely narrative format. The detailed guidelines, again, for the earlier phases have been updated. They don't make it very obvious what the changes are, by the way. They could have highlighted those or something. I'm going to try to pull some of those out for you. But those two documents are available. The sports and recreation, as of this morning when I last checked, didn't have summary guidelines yet. Not every industry has summary guidelines. They have the detailed guidelines. The detailed guidelines that are roughly 12 pages, single spaced for all of the industries are what each business is then required to click at the end of the PDF online and fill in information about their business and then click to basically sign and affirm that they will agree to abide by the guidelines. Again, those guidelines further incorporate New York State Department of Health guidelines and the federal CDC guidelines, and you have to agree that you're going to follow those as well. You don't have to submit anything to the state other than clicking that and filling out that information, but you do have to create a safety plan for your business and able to be properly open. And they provide a template that you can use to create that plan. The template might be sufficient for some businesses. Others will just want to use it sort of as a guideline or checklist in preparing a separate document that will be more usable within your business. I'm going to get back to the safety plan in a little bit, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about the guidelines first. Again, we're up to however many different industry-specific guidelines at this point. I can't go through them separately. They all have some general principles through them, and I will just summarize some of those. They all require some form of health screening each day for employees before they begin work. The screening could include temperature checks, for example, but at a minimum, they have to include questioning employees about their exposure, and I'll go into more detail on that. Employees have to maintain 6 feet between each other unless either safety or the nature of the work requires them to come in closer proximity. If they do have to come into closer proximity, they generally have to wear a mask or face covering. Employers must provide employees with face coverings at no cost. However, employees all have the right to wear their own suitable face coverings. Suitable meaning, for most positions, it's the same as what you are expected to wear when you go into a store these days. You have a wide range of discretion in what you're wearing. But if the nature of the job generally requires a higher protective level, whether N95 or some other industry standard face covering because of exposure to fumes or manufacturing capacity or what have you, there's other requirements, then you would still be expected to meet that. Employees can't choose to wear something less protective than what they would normally have to wear just because of COVID-19. But in most cases, employees weren't expected to wear face coverings at work except for because of COVID-19, and they have discretion there. In-person gatherings still are supposed to be limited as much as possible. In a lot of these business reopening guidelines, there are occupancy restrictions. Pretty much when you're going to be inside, they're using a 50% occupancy threshold, and that's not necessarily based on how many employees you've had or whatever. It's actually looking at their certificate of occupancy for the building or space, and then overall people in there shouldn't be exceeding 50%. But make sure you double check your industry specific guidelines and continue to check them as they may change. All businesses have to provide and post signs throughout the worksite to emphasize proper hygiene, social distancing rules, appropriate use of PPE, and cleaning and disinfecting protocols. There's 6 or 7 specific items that have to be placed into signs and posted throughout the workplace, including remember to stay at least 6 feet apart. You know, if not, wear your mask. Here's how you wash your hands. You are expected to actually post those signs. Companies have to maintain logs of all workers and visitors who might have had close contact with each other at the site. This is to help contact tracing down the road. So you should know who has come into the building on a given day and given times. There's a specific exception in some of these guidelines for delivery people wearing proper PPE. So if you just have, you know, the FedEx or UPS or postal service person showing up at reception and dropping something off, they don't necessarily have to be logged, but people who otherwise are generally in the premises to do anything, you're supposed to have a log of it. So if you're like that Apple processing plant in central New York, where a bunch of people tested positive for COVID-19, the local and state health agencies can help track those people down and prevent the spread of the virus. And that goes right into this last component, that there is an obligation that employers notify state and local health departments if a worker tests positive for COVID-19, and then assist with the contact tracing efforts. Pretty clear that assist with contact tracing efforts is not going to mean call everybody who might have come into contact with all of the people that work for you. It's at least provide that information for the logs and contact information for employees and stuff like that. So again, that is just a very quick summary of what in most cases is 12 pages of guidelines. The other thing I wanted to do is point out some of the notable items that I have seen change from most of the early guidelines to now. The detailed guidelines all have a date at the top, say updated as of or effective as of or something like that. And again, most of the phase 1 and phase 2 guidelines now have dates that have been updated in the last few days. But as far as I've been able to find, there's no easy way to compare them to any previous versions. And they could change at a moment's notice without anybody telling you. So you pretty much literally are going to have to keep checking back periodically. Here are some of the changes. They now, in addition to various other signs, are requiring people to post signs about appropriate respiratory hygiene and cough etiquette. So we're now back to the types of signs that became popular with H1N1 and some of the previous flu epidemics, which I presume mean, you know, cough into your elbow and not into your hands and that sort of thing. There's also a requirement for signage explaining to people that if they have visibly soiled hands, they need to wash those with soap and water and not just use hand sanitizer. So that's the newest signage requirements. There is just a formatting change, really. The section that in the guidance previously was hygiene and cleaning is now hygiene, cleaning, and disinfection. There's a little bit more emphasis on you're not just cleaning, but you're actually disinfecting surfaces when appropriate. You have to now provide receptacles for disposal of soiled items, including PPE, throughout the building. That's not really specified in more detail. Is the standard garbage can an acceptable receptacle? I suppose it depends on what PPE is involved, the volume of it, etc. within your operations. There is now a reference to the CDC's website on symptoms of coronavirus, where initially the guidelines took the CDC's then list of symptoms and put it right in the guidelines. I think the CDC keeps updating that list, so the state is now just providing literally a hyperlink over to the CDC's website. I'll get back to why that's important related to this next point. You must designate a central point of contact regarding your questionnaires. While it says central point of contact, this can depend based on shift, location, etc. So it doesn't have to be one person throughout an entire organization, but there has to be somebody responsible for questionnaires, meaning the questionnaires of employees and potentially other people that come into a site about their exposure or potential exposure or symptoms related to coronavirus. That is part of the reason why what the symptoms of coronavirus are is important and have to be on top of mind as well. So let me go into that mandatory screening. So again, the guidelines require screening. They allow that it could include temperature checks, and possibly in some cases it could include COVID-19 tests. Most businesses are not going to be in that situation. And then it says that at a minimum you have to do a daily questionnaire to ask people whether they've been exposed to people who have tested positive for COVID-19, whether they've had any symptoms, or of course whether they've tested positive. There is encouragement to do this remotely for a couple of different reasons, but it can be done on site, but it has to be done before people start working for the day. If you do it remotely, there's two theories. One, obviously people don't risk getting there, having coronavirus, and then spreading it to somebody either on their way to work or as they are being screened in the first place when they enter the building or something. The other thing I've seen in some of the latest guidelines is the suggestion that, especially if you're doing temperature checks, it might actually be better to have people test their temperature at home rather than wait until they've traveled to get to work, because various environmental factors could influence their temperature that would mean that their temperature is artificially elevated or even reduced in some cases before they get to work. Especially imagine a case where somebody walks to work or walks from parking to the building any distance. That could potentially affect the temperature reading. But normally whatever their temperature is at home before they've left the house is probably a pretty good indicator of what their temperature would be once they're at work and doing their normal tasks. So those are a couple of reasons why remote is better. We actually have a question I'll go ahead and answer now because it obviously fits in. Is paper or electronic better? You can do either way. You can do telephonic. You could theoretically call people or have them call in before they come into work and be asked whether they have tested positive for coronavirus or whether they have any symptoms. So far, the experience seems to be that it really just depends on what your operational realities are. What is easier? Who do you have on site who can be the screener, or do you need to do that more remotely? How many work sites do you have? Whatever you do have to maintain the records, and somebody has to review them daily. In addition, apparently, in addition to sending the people home if they say yes to any of the questions. So we've mostly seen that depend on operations. Yeah, you're another question Popped right up. Yes, you're right. You're not allowed to record their temperatures. You can't keep a recording of that. You can keep a recording of their answers to the request or to the questionnaire. Let me get to the questionnaire. So here are the questions that you have to ask. Have you knowingly been in close or proximate contact in the past 14 days with anyone who's tested positive for COVID-19 or who has symptoms of COVID-19? Have you tested positive for COVID-19 in the past 14 days? Have you experienced any symptoms of COVID-19 in the past 14 days? When you get to the list of symptoms, fever is one of those symptoms. So in essence, the elevated temperature is basically the same as answering yes that you've had any of these symptoms of COVID-19 in the past 14 days. So I would basically record it that way. I think if you want to indicate that temperature testing was done, you can do that. But the way I look at it, and again, I'm not a big advocate for the temperature testing personally, but I think the recording is the safest way to record it is as a measure of saying yes to having symptoms of COVID-19. Let me talk about the symptoms because this list keeps expanding. Originally, there were a few items, and then it was if you have 2 or more of these other items. But now all of these are symptoms, which if you have any of these things, technically you're supposed to say yes to this question about have you had any symptoms of COVID-19 in the past 14 days? Fever, chills, cough, shortness of breath, difficulty breathing, fatigue, muscle, body aches, headache, new loss of taste or smell, sore throat, congestion, runny nose, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. I mean, there are probably some really healthy people out there, but my theory is that there's a good percentage of the world who experiences at least one of these symptoms in the average 14-day period. I know allergies have been really bad for a lot of people, myself included lately. So, some of these symptoms may indicate allergies. I specifically asked a question through the regional control room in Western New York as to what happens if the employee says that the symptoms are caused by something else. They said, well, the state is taking a highly restrictive view on this, so you still have to send them home and have them get a test. They want everybody who might possibly have any reason to believe they might arguably have COVID-19 to get tested. So once they get tested, then maybe they can come back to work. Let's talk about that. What the guidelines now do, instead of telling you right in the guidelines how to respond to yes responses to any of these questionnaires, is they reference an interim guidance document from the New York State Department of Health. It is called the Interim Guidance for Public and Private Employees Returning to Work Following COVID-19 Infection or Exposure. So that document, which is linked again from all of the guidance documents now as updated, provides that if the person has been symptomatic, they have to go into a 10-day isolation from the onset of symptoms or the receipt of a negative test. If they get a positive test, they have to have a 10-day isolation from the onset of symptoms or from the first positive test. If they've had close contact with a person with COVID-19 and they have symptoms, then they have to have a 10-day isolation from the onset of the symptoms. If they've had close contact with a person who had COVID-19 but have no symptoms, then they have to have a 14-day self-quarantine unless they're essential and critical for the operations or safety of the workplace. Fortunately, I think I haven't had to work through too many of these situations. I don't know whether that's because nobody is reporting any of this stuff and then nobody's calling me, or that just people are dealing with it on site and not bothering to call me. But they did change this from what was in previous guidance, and the logic is more detailed than the original guidance, where normally we were just talking about 14-day quarantines. Now this 10-day isolation from onset of symptoms differs from 14-day self-quarantine based on the expectations of how long symptoms last or how long somebody who might be asymptomatic could still transmit the virus to someone else. These guidelines, like I said, are specifically called interim guidance, and they could be updated from the Department of Health at a moment's notice. And if the CDC, for example, changed their guidance, then the State Department of Health will probably change its guidance. So again, you evidently have to just refresh this website, very often. The guidance says that you're supposed to have a person designated as your site safety monitor whose responsibilities include continuous compliance with all aspects of the organization's site safety plan. And I think if they're not going onto the state website and checking your industry specific guidance on a pretty much daily basis, then they're probably not doing enough to stay on top of the situation. The guidance isn't going to change every day, but you just don't know when it's going to change. And as far as I can tell, the state's not going to send you a press release. So that is another unfortunate aspect of trying to keep up and do the right thing. All right, a note on antibody testing, and then just a few more slides, and we'll get to the questions. The antibody testing issue for a while was interesting in the sense that there was even a concern that everybody was going to have to get antibody testing as a condition of returning to work. In other words, if you could show that you tested positive for the antibody, then you could work, but until then you couldn't work. That idea, at least for now, is completely out the window. The CDC's current guidelines say antibody tests, in fact, should not be used to make decisions about returning persons to the workplace. Based on that, the EEOC issued guidance yesterday, specifically noting that therefore there's no legitimate business reason for employers to require employees to be tested for coronavirus antibodies. The Americans with Disabilities Act generally prohibits employers from requiring their employees to submit to medical testing unless there is a legitimate business reason. And because the CDC has concluded right now there's no legitimate business reason, you can't have them tested in the first place. I don't know if anybody was doing that, but if you were, now it is more clear that you cannot require it. If somebody were to volunteer that information, slightly separate question as to what you then do with it. There's still probably a belief that having the antibody suggests you might be less susceptible, but if you were to treat that person differently from somebody who hadn't tested positive for the antibody, then arguably there's a disability discrimination claim or even some other disability or some other discrimination claim to be had in that scenario. So at the moment, subject to further medical developments, the antibody testing probably should not be on your radar in the workplace. Just to hit on the safety plans again, there's templates available. Each business must have one to be open, even if they were originally open as an essential business. has to be posted conspicuously on site. It's not clear exactly what that requires at a minimum. I think the state would have you blow it up and put it on the front door so everybody who walks in could read it. Posting conspicuously is similar language to what they say in laws and regulations for the various employee rights notices. So I think if you have a bulletin board somewhere where you post the minimum wage poster and those other posters you have to put up and you put your safety plan there, it'd be pretty hard for the government to complain. You don't have to submit your plan to the government. In fact, they don't want you to do that. It would just be a waste of time and a bunch of paper they don't want, or emails they don't want. But the government has indicated, state, local, that if they have to come in because of an issue related to your safety issues or operations at this time, they're going to ask for your plan, and it better be there ready to be provided to them. So we're going to go into questions in a second. So if you have them that haven't been answered, please go ahead and start typing them in. Last time I had the slide about expecting changes. Now I'm shifting a little bit to some looming questions. I think these are going to be important between now and potentially our next webinar over the next month or so over the summer. First big question is, when will the restrictions be relaxed? We know that we have these 4 phases. Most parts of the states are in phase 3. At least we know what phase 3 looks like everywhere because the guidance is out. We don't know what phase 4 is going to mean. It's interesting, as I'll go into in a second. But there has never been any information about, okay, we get to phase 4, then what? What has been clear is just because we went from phase 1 to phase 2 or phase 2 to phase 3, the guidelines weren't relaxed for the most part on the businesses who had been in phase 1 or the businesses who'd been in phase 2. A little bit of exception, for example, with the hair salons and beauty parlors, the restaurants, they've kind of gradually phased in more operations, but nobody is at the point of where we were before March. The question is whether we will ever be. And I jump ahead here. This vaccine point, if and when and whether and how there will be a vaccine, is probably going to be a huge factor in determining if, when, whether, and how we get back to where we were before March of 2020. But will the state keep updating their guidelines over time, hopefully to relax some of the restrictions? At some point, will there be an all clear or just across the board guideline, more minimum guideline? Remains to be seen. But I just want to double emphasize for anybody who otherwise was thinking it, phase 1 is not normal reopening, nor does phase 2 mean that businesses in phase 1 can then go back to normal reopening. For now, reopening means under extensive restrictions and limitations imposed by New York State and by reference the CDC. Another big issue to be wondering about: what happens when schools reopen in the fall? A lot of employers have had employees working from home, which happened to coincide to a time when students were working at home or supposed to be doing schoolwork at home. We're now at a summer period where there are, in some cases, some limited childcare options, or more limited anyway. Day camps can be open, sleepaway camps cannot. Summer schools, at least at the public school level, are pretty limited and mostly remote. And even the private schools can't do much more unless they were to shift to more of a daycare model. So that's all interesting. The fall is going to be a big consideration, because not only then will there be the childcare issue if students don't go back or don't go back every day, then they will also have the issue of the students not only needing to be supervised, but in fact still learning. So there will be now the remote learning if they're not in the school. And so it's not just going to be enough to send them off to a day camp like it might be over the summer, because they're actually going to have to be doing their schoolwork. So that's going to get complicated. Too early to guess as to how that's going to work. Unfortunately, by the time the state tells us, it might be too late to adequately prepare, but that's going to have to be what it's going to have to be. I'm only throwing it out there, even if you're not involved in a school. Professionally, if you have kids, that might be one factor, but more importantly, every business is likely to have employees with students, and they've already been struggling, and they may have new struggles come the fall, and we really don't know what's going to happen in the fall. And we won't know for a while, but you should be monitoring that, especially to the extent that it affects your employees' personal situations. Finally, will there be a second surge? There's been a large uptick, frankly, in a lot of parts of the country. New York has been so restrictive in its reopening that the numbers are, amazing and borderline insignificant. But, clearly the state is not giving up its effort to keep the numbers extremely low. But we don't know things like whether temperature changes and the flu season will change things again in the fall or winter into early spring of next year. I guess the only thing we know is now we have, innumerable guidelines, and we'll continue to develop more guidelines so that if something else does happen, at least we have a better starting point than we did in 2020. All right, there's a few questions that I will start to answer. As I do that, I just want to let people know that, we can only do webinars every so often, and stuff's changing constantly. We can't keep up with every industry thing that changes on a potentially daily basis, if I'm being honest. But the best way to get information, we have a monthly newsletter you can sign up for, and you can follow us on LinkedIn, where we try to post anything we can as fast as we can to at least point you to new documents that might be relevant when we catch them. So I will take questions. I'm gonna, in a minute, make the link available to the slides. One of the questions I have is, can we share the slides, as we did in the last webinar? And yes, but I also want to note, I'm going to do that, but I also want to note that you can always go to the website and find the previous webinars various ways on the website. But I mean, there's a search box at the top of the screen, and if you typed in webinar, for example, it would give you the previous webinars, and you could get the link that way. So if you wanted to go back and get some of the earlier information, you didn't get them right now. But while you're typing in questions, let me go ahead and put this up. So hopefully you all get the link to the slides. I'm going to start answering questions. Again, as you're asking questions, keep in mind that this is not entirely confidential. I'm not going to read your name or identify your organization, but there's no attorney-client privilege in this forum. So if you need to ask that type of more specific question, you can contact me. Here's my contact information. The one question I have had come in is, are employers required to train employees when they return to work? And the answer to that is, in fact, yes. For example, you must, according to the guidelines, train all employees on the proper use of PPE, specifically including face coverings. So you're actually supposed to train all employees on how to put on a face mask and how to take it off and how to properly dispose of it or clean it. So that is a training requirement that you have. I mean, generally, you should probably do a little bit more even than that. Let people know where The cleaning stations are, I mean, in most cases, it's probably fairly obvious where the sinks are, but if there's a unusual work situation or you're on site and construction or something like that, make sure people know how to wash their hands. You also should be communicating with the employees as to the daily screening requirements. There's not a formal training requirement in the sense that there's no guidelines from the state on here's all the things you should include in a COVID-19 return to work training program. But depending on the nature of your organization, wouldn't be a bad idea to use the guidelines in your company specific safety plan to provide that type of training. But again, there are specific requirements for training, but they're relatively limited in the guidelines themselves. Let's see, another question. All right, so another question that's come in is about whether you have to count the time the employees are being screened, including potentially temperature scans or answering these questions, whether you have to count that as time worked. And I don't think there's an answer to that question, but I think in the sense of, I don't think it's 100% guaranteed answer to that question. I would say generally, if the employee gets to the work location and then has to answer questions, get temperature screened, etc., then they're probably working at that point in time. To keep it more simple than, the question rightly references something called the Portal to Portal Act. The other issue is if you're doing remote screening and you have to call in before you go to work, is that compensable time? And then does it turn all of the time that you spend from that point until you end your shift into compensable time? I haven't seen good, reliable guidelines that suggest that that's all necessarily compensable time. If you have the ability to track the 2 minutes that somebody spends calling in, then the safest thing might be to count that as compensable time. But there are also de minimis rules around time recording. So if somebody just spends 2 minutes doing that and then goes into work and works their regular day and you just pay them for their regular day, I would argue that you might be okay. But it is an open question that people have debated. There will be lawsuits filed based on it. There will be lawsuits based on a lot of issues related to the coronavirus. A lot of these pay claims, discrimination claims, etc., allow for the recovery of attorney's fees. So, for better or worse, plaintiff employee side lawyers are going to file lawsuits and test some of these issues. On the whole, however, one would hope that having to call in for 2 minutes before you head out to work doesn't turn your whole 25-minute commute into compensable time. It would be a pretty poor policy and pretty inconsistent with the state's interest in reducing coronavirus. But again, once they get on site, I think your argument gets more difficult that they're not working. So far, I think that's all the questions that I have seen come in. If you have any more questions, please go ahead and answer them. Again, I anticipate a part 3. We will wait and see how things develop to get to determine when we get to the part 3. So we want to be as effective as possible and as timely as possible, but we want to have new information to share as well. So I'm going to give about 30 seconds to see if anybody has a question. If you have one, but it's taking you a long time to type it in, just click enter so we at least know that you're trying to type a question, and then I'll certainly wait. All right, so I'm still not seeing any more questions. Thanks to all of you who have taken this time to listen to this information. Hopefully it was helpful. Obviously, there are a million questions that are coming up related to these issues, and we can't possibly address all of them in an hour, but I wanted to give you some of the general things that you should be thinking about and checking on and being mindful of as you go forward, trying to keep, especially if you're responsible for keeping your organization on the right track. Again, the website is important. The forward, I can't remember, forward.newyork.gov, I think will get you there in the first instance, and then you click on what phase you want to look at your guidelines for. It just changes without notice, and the best you can do is keep track. And again, we try to post that information when we come across it, but I can't guarantee you that we can post something every time any individual industry gets updated. So with that, I will sign off and thank you all for attending today's webinar.